Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Candid Caller. We're so happy to have you with us for this week's thrilling topic. So this week we wanted to dive into the world of stalking, but specifically giving space to a man to share his story. I know that typically when one thinks of stalking or reads about stalking in media, it does tend to be women who are the victims, and we felt and we were encouraged and excited that a man had got in touch to share his story with us of stalking. This week in particular, stalking is a huge umbrella term, and we really wanted to specifically speak about stalking as it pertains to delusion, and that the stalker feels deeply that the person whom is their victim is someone who they're in a personal relationship with. So that's kind of specifically what we're going to be speaking about, and we're delighted to have that perspective from a man this week as well.
It's actually very brave. I feel like not many men actually want to speak about their experiences.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think as well, I was really encouraged as well when I saw recently the Netflix series Baby Reindeer, because although it was like deeply troubling and like really horrific and like really stark, it really showed that perspective of a man being on the other side. And we know, and we spoke about this last week, that 1 in 6 women will be stalked and 1 in 4 men. So women are statistically more prone to being stalked.
However, I always have the question there.
Yeah.
Actually, are women stalked more? Because they probably are, but also I feel like men don't speak about it as much. So are the statistics as realistic? I feel like women are more open to talk about it, but there will be men that have been stalked, but they're too embarrassed to talk about it, and then the statistic isn't balanced.
Well, we know the statistics in general, as it pertains to anything to do with crime, are always are always slightly off. So we know that, like, specifically in terms of like reported crime, so whether it's stalking, whether it's theft, whether it's sexual assault, whatever it is, whatever category it falls into, criminologists, we believe that it's 60% higher. So whatever the crime rate is, it's usually 60% higher when we take into account unreported crime. And we know that crimes are statistically, especially cases of stalking, tend to not get reported because it's something that's really difficult to uncover. And
well, for women, and then also for men,
and for men who might feel not encouraged or not empowered to come forward, especially if the person talking to them is a woman. So it might make that connection quite difficult.
Right. That's actually something that we were speaking about the other day. Like, we wanted to get more men on Candid, but actually there's not as many men that want to come and speak about it.
Yeah. So we're so happy that someone got in touch. Before we talk to our caller in the next few minutes, we wanted to speak about a case that really closely tied in to the case that has been, shared with us by our caller, which was the stalking of David Letterman by Margaret Mary J. in the 80s. And this case was made huge headlines across the state. I mean, obviously we weren't alive, but had we been alive, I'm sure we would have realized that it was a huge case at the time. It was, there was an enormous amount of media interest in what was going on. We know that she stalked him from 1980, as you mentioned, up until right before the 2000s. And actually, I think underpinning this case, although, yes, it was a case of stalking and she did commit, crimes against him, for example, breaking into his home. She also stole his car. She left him very disturbing messages. So there was a huge amount of disturbance in the case. But what we also know about Margaret was that she suffered from schizophrenia. And so she, reports, there's only so much you can read, but reports have mentioned that, she really suffered with her mental health. And as a result of this condition, she genuinely believed that she was in a relationship with him.
In love with her,
Yeah, absolutely. And so mental illness was a really big undercurrent through this story. And sadly, when I was reading the media reporting of the case back from that time, you actually, it wasn't discussed. It was just sensationalized. Like, oh my God, David Letterman, who obviously at the time was one of the most famous men in TV in America, is being stalked. And so, oh my God, how sensationalized and how
'cause I was
dramatic.
gonna say, is it super famous because it was a woman that was stalking a man, and at that time it wasn't a very common thing?
Sure, but also because it was him.
Okay. He was well known.
Yes. And so it was, hugely reported in the media, but leaving out mostly this mental health element, which was so important. She was arrested multiple times on charges. So as relating to breaking into his home, stealing his car. Again, I think that the stalking discourse and rhetoric has come a really long way from the 80s. Certainly the way that things were reported back then is different to now. So I guess that's a positive. No, in terms of,
or the way that people reported their own crimes.
But also the way that the media speak about it. Okay. Also, certainly there's still work to do. And sadly, the stalking ended because she did in the end commit suicide. And she had this untreated, illness of schizophrenia, which I'm sure at the time people didn't, still now it's very difficult to diagnose. It's very difficult to treat. There's not enough support. There's not enough care. People don't feel as though there are places that they can go if they themselves or others are suffering from mental illness. So I think highlighting this story was important to us because it echoes what our caller is going to share with us, but also to speak about the mental health element, which I think a lot of times gets lost when people are trying to make this big story.
I think for most people, it's kind of hard to feel bad for people that do really bad things, and like stalking, breaking into someone's house, you're giving them trauma off the back of understandably like your own trauma because you have schizophrenia, but actually now you're creating a victim out of your own
suffering.
So it's kind of sad. Obviously they need help, but ultimately it's still really wrong what she did. So
yeah, for sure.
Bit of mixed emotions.
Yeah. And I think there's like two sides. I think that you can, this is the way I think about it. And I think definitely the way that I've thought about crime has evolved in the last few years. But from my studies to also working in a startup where all we deal with is crime, and that's what we're trying to combat. But I think that when I think about crime, you can think about it as a two-parter. So you can have empathy for people who are suffering, but also try and combat that head on as well, because no one should be the victim of stalking, and the person who is stalking, who may have schizophrenia, may have PTSD, may have anxiety, depression, all these other things that are, increasingly common, should also receive care. So you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as justice, and you can also look at it as care. And I think when you look at it like that, it breeds a much healthier conversation about things like stalking, which, like we saw with Baby Reindeer, became, I've never seen such a huge media storm. Yeah, it was the sensation story, which, I think definitely the series was slightly frustrating because it was, in a sense, dramatizing something that's really serious.
I thought it was great when I initially watched it. I thought
it was great.
It was amazing. It was really well filmed. But great obviously acting. After we watched the Piers Morgan interview of the actual woman, I guess you kind of get a different perspective. But then again, she still just is in the wrong. And if you watch the interview with Piers Morgan, she is quite delusional.
But you
still,
can believe
I think,
that
about
she's
things
in the
that
wrong.
are kind of factual, though.
Yeah, but this is what
maybe
I'm
some
saying.
things were dramatized, but actually, you did stalk him. That's just kind of.
But also, this is what I'm saying of this two-parter. I think you can look at it and say, yes, she's in the wrong, and she committed crimes against him, against his family. And I think stalking can be horribly intrusive. That's the nature of it. And the person who's being stalked probably in their heart feels quite little empathy because they're in such distress of the situation. It's so desperate. But as an
You have to put yourself in
onlooker,
their shoes. Like if I had a
yeah.
stalker, the last thing I would feel was I would feel bad for him or her.
We are delighted to have a caller all the way from America who will be hopefully candidly sharing his story of stalking. And yeah, we're so pleased that we have someone who's willing to share and hopefully start a healthy conversation about stalking, about themes of mental health as well, and the way that possibly this stalking has impacted him and his family as well. So without further ado. Okay, so as mentioned, we are really pleased that we have a caller today all the way from America who is going to share his story as it relates to a case of stalking. So thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate you being here with us and being open to share your story. We'd love to start with asking you and learning a little bit about what your life was like before this story unfolded, if you're comfortable, please.
Sure. I'm a surgeon, and I have been in practice for many years. And during that time, I've had the pleasure of taking care of hundreds, if not thousands of patients. And, you know, patient-physician relationships always very unique because each person is unique. But historically, there's a sort of a boundary and a reverence and a sort of a normalcy to the interactions, although people's personalities are, of course, quite different and their emotional experiences are different. But, there's a sort of a professionalism that is normally always maintained. And yeah, I've always enjoyed being a physician because I like the intimacy that being a doctor provides. You have a special relationship with people that you perhaps don't have with your accountant or your lawyer. And with that comes a heavy responsibility, but one that's very, powerful and inspiring and moving. So I very much enjoyed that aspect of my professional career. And for the most part, I've had most of my patients have been incredibly memorable and grateful.
Yeah, no. I mean, you're so right. I think a physician and his patients do have that sort of closeness, of course, because it's all related to health and wellness. So we know that your story relates to a woman in particular who was, for lack of a better word, sort of obsessed with you. Would you mind sharing a little bit of background as it relates to sort of what that first encounter was like when you met her? And then, share with us a little bit about this story and how it's affected you.
Sure, yeah. The interaction was quite ordinary in that it was no different than any other interaction. I had taken care of her and everything had gone well, and there was nothing out of the ordinary in regards to that interaction. And we went about our way. And then can't remember exactly how long it was. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, a year later, 2 years later, she resurfaced back into our practice. And from that moment on, it was very interesting. She resurfaced to our practice just to say hello, because obviously the interaction we had finished, and she sort of just came to say hi, just wanted to say hi. I think she had, left town for a while or what have you. She came back, and from that moment on, it was just this very bizarre sort of, I don't know what the right word is at the moment, but she definitely was very overtly kind and sweet. For example, she baked a cake, which in maybe certain circumstances is not that odd, but given that I had no interaction with her for 2 years, all of a sudden to get a cake was a bit unusual. And that, when she reemerged to our practice, it was a little bit fascinating because we had no reason to see her. When I see patients, usually, after a period of time, they move on with their lives. And of course, naturally, if they have another issue or what have you, we'll see them again. But certainly we don't just randomly see patients just because, they drop by to say hi.
And you probably hope, in a sense, that your patients don't have to come back, in a sense, because they're probably fit and well and sort of, like you say, going about their lives. So
yeah, I mean,
so yeah,
we obviously you take care of a patient until their condition is finite. right? There's an endpoint
Right.
to that care. And so if it happens to be a smooth journey, great. If it happens to be a little bit, tumultuous in terms of needing a little more care, this so be it. But once the interaction is complete, barring a
Yeah.
new interaction, usually you don't ever see them back again. So
Right. Right. And so she came round with her cake, sort of had this sort of overly kind appearance, or that's the way that she sort of was interacting with you and I guess the people who are working your practice. And then when did it sort of become an issue? Because you hear a lot with stalking cases that it sort of escalates over time and then it comes to sort of a pivotal moment where it actually starts to impact your life and impact kind of maybe the way that you interact with people or you go about the world. So was there sort of an encounter or something, or perhaps a progression that you can mark that sort of showed that?
yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, again, a patient showing up out of the blue, bringing me a cake is not going to send me into a tailspin. I mean, at first you're like, that's very
Right.
sweet, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. It began with that, and then
Right.
there was a lot of unwanted, gifts. This individual had children. Her children started engaging in our practice, and she would send her children into my practice to like bring these gifts, which was very awkward for the children and obviously awkward for us.
Yeah.
Then, it just kept escalating to, there was an album that she created, which was something right from a movie, right? With cutouts and pictures and
Oh my
something that
God.
would really, when you would see it, it would really take your breath away because it clearly demonstrated a major unwellness, and B, the commitment and
Right.
time it takes to make it. It wasn't just something you go buy. This is something you spend hours upon hours creating. And luckily, the interactions were always positive, meaning she was always very,
You never felt necessarily
no, she was
threatened.
always very complimentary, right? She's always saying good
Yeah.
things about me, but they were obviously unwanted and not
Mm-hmm.
reciprocated. And so, it
Yeah.
wasn't as though she was threatening me. They were all in the framework of admiration and arguably in many instances love. But this was a
Yeah.
unilateral
Wow.
experience that was not, obviously um, felt by me. I have actually no interaction with this
Right.
woman prior to our one encounter as a patient and doctor. So as this kept escalating and there was more and more of these things, cards, teddy bears, this album, it started to get very uncomfortable. And then there would be the periodic just show up in my office, right? And then
Oh
you could
wow.
see that she was not well. She would be wearing, costumes and wigs, sometimes to be sort of, I don't know, incognito, and it was hardly anything incognito, but it was her attempt at doing so. I think the parts where her children were involved were very uncomfortable because
What?
obviously her children were fine and normal, but they were used part of
Yeah.
the interactions. And I've had,
Yeah.
Would she like, were they gifts that she gave them to give you, or she would make them like essentially make you a drawing or something of that sort?
no, yeah, it was basically, let's say for example, let's say for example, if she did bake me cookies, because we had gotten to a point where over time, as this became more progressive, we had told her, hey, listen, we can't have you just dropping by in the middle of our day in our office, right? Because
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not
at first
professional.
we'd
Right.
never say anything. Somebody's been kind to you, but then after a while, it gets out of control. So then she would send her
Right.
children in to bring those cookies and or other gifts as sort of as
Oh,
messengers, right? Because you know,
yikes.
she, the
She
kids would
wasn't
walk into the
allowed.
lobby of the office and so on and so forth. So, um, it became incredibly uncomfortable. That's for sure.
Mm.
And at which time we obviously had to get the police involved and they weren't just like, hey, here's a cake. It was, hey, I love you. Here's a cake.
Oh my gosh.
Right. And
Yeah.
it wasn't, hey, I love you. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, we're meant to be. You're my soulmate. You and I are
Oh my
destined to be
God.
together. It was,
Like total split from
yeah, she had
reality.
her
Like,
she had her own relationship. I mean, in her mind, we were married, right?
wow.
And so at some point I had to get the authorities involved because, she would just show up. And so,
Yeah.
you know, that's when we got the authorities involved. And initially we started out with trespassing. You can't be, I filed a report. They said, okay, now that, because unfortunately, as I'm sure I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in the States, there's very little that the authorities can do until you've filed something formal,
Yeah, absolutely.
right?
Yeah. And a lot of times that they don't get involved. I mean, especially in instances where women are being stalked, you hear a lot where authorities or the police will say, well, there's not much we can do unless he touches you or unless this person actually physically gets close to you. So it becomes very difficult actually to build a case in a lot of instances.
Yeah. So when I happen to have a lot of friends in law enforcement and I live in a smaller community, so I reached out to them and they said, well, if she just drops by randomly, we can't just, unless she does something violent, we can't do anything. However, if you, start out by getting a trespassing type report, like, if then you can call us. And when she comes to your place of work, we can show up. So I did that.
Yeah.
Is that a restraining order? Sorry,
Not a
the
restraining order, because a
trespassing.
restraining order is a massive undertaking, requires court.
Absolutely.
But this is a simple trespassing. Like, you're not allowed on my.
You can't come on the
You can't
premises.
come on my property. Right.
Okay.
Of course, if I were to go to a supermarket, she could follow me there, and I can go to a coffee shop. But at least when it came to my place of work, they gave the police or the authorities some latitude. So I started with that, but this woman is very bright, very savvy, and has some elements of schizophrenia in that she has elements of delusions of grandeur, which means she thinks she's a lawyer, an investigator, and so on and so forth. And she was very clever. And she wasn't bothered by the police, showing up or telling her, hey, or calling her and saying, hey, these unwanted proposals are starting to bother the doctor. She wasn't really frightened by it. She was fairly bold and kind of knew that she's kind of untouchable at that point.
Jeez. It's interesting because it's kind of like you hear a lot with stalking cases where it's to do with delusion, that there's lots of different types of delusion, but one is grandeur to do with feeling as though you're sort of like really important person.
She's going to get her husband.
Yeah. But then there's also a delusion where you feel as though that the person who you're stalking, obviously they don't see it that way, is, your husband. It's someone who's in love with you. So it's interesting that it's like almost a mix of the two as opposed to just being one. Okay, so you got the police involved and she wasn't fazed by that. What was there more escalation after that?
There was. So at some juncture, and then the other thing is that she would have these. So as a physician, I know the different variations of mental health, and she definitely had many aspects of schizophrenia. And one of them was, in schizophrenia, one of them is this obviously is delusions. And these delusions of grandeur, and also a tremendous amount of paranoia and other things of that nature. So she would even go on to social media and do some moments of mania where at like 3 a.m, she would just start writing things. Again, all very positive, right? And I was always so grateful that she wasn't trying to destroy me by writing negative things, tarnish me, and just they were all positive, but they were extreme, right? So what happened was the final aspect was there was an event in which I was involved in an event, and they were selling tickets to this event, and I had told the event organizers that I suspect that she would come, that I had asked them to kindly refuse her entry because I just didn't want her in this event. It was going to be incredibly awkward and things of that nature. So sure enough, as suspected, she came to the event and they turned her away. And while we have no proof of this, within an hour or two, there was like a sign outside my door of my office, and it had caught on fire.
What?
Yeah. So, and the next morning when I came to the office,
Oh my
the fire
gosh.
department had already
Wow.
put it out.
So that's escalating to it. That's a totally
Yeah,
different
we
kettle
we
of
don't
fish.
we
That,
don't
yeah.
know. There's no footage or any evidence, and nobody, they said it was a short. It was a short in the
Okay.
electrical system, but the proximity of time from when
Yeah.
that occurred, and that was enough for me to finally take the final step, which was at which point I went ahead and hired a lawyer and finally got a restraining order.
And did that bring you sort of a level of comfort, knowing that she would then not be able
It
to?
doesn't.
Because it's interesting, like come to your practice, follow you to the supermarket, like none of those things at that point. I mean, it really minimizes the risk, I guess.
It doesn't, and I'll tell you why. It
Yeah.
doesn't it doesn't take away the anxiety associated with the person because the person's not well. And when you're not well,
Yeah.
you don't recognize the law of common order. So the fact that they have a restraining order only is comforting in that if they break it, there's some recourse. But it doesn't mean that an illogical person
That you'll be safe,
would say,
essentially.
hey, I better not call him this time or show up because I have a restraining order. Because if they responded to that, they would respond to conventional logic, which says this guy's not interested.
To end, I would love to ask you if you have, I mean, you've laid out the story so eloquently and spoken through everything. And certainly the way you dealt with the situation was so sensibly and calmly and all of that. So you sound to be someone who has a lot of those traits. Could we end by just asking you if you could give a bit of advice to anyone out there who might be living through a similar situation or something that you learned and would like to share? I think that could be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very frightening experience because at the end of the day, there's this person out there who is not well. And that's the thing about it that's most frightening because, you don't, you know, we all get up every day and we are relying on law, order, logic, biology, physics, things that we can count on. So it's a very scary feeling. But I think that number one, I wouldn't do it in isolation, right? I mean, I try to share this information with loved ones so that you have a group of people that are helping you through the process. Unfortunately, our legal system is such that it isn't a great deal of help. And of course, if you can get a restraining order and the situation is bad enough that it warrants it, then you should. But I think the thing that I tried to do, and I don't know if it's accurate or not, is I tried initially to not engage. And I know it was very hard not to engage because your natural tendency is that you want to, I don't want to say retaliate, but you certainly want to
Try and knock some sense into
knock some
them.
sense into them. And I don't know that this is what an expert would tell you to do because I certainly am not an expert in stalking. But I felt like if I could have not given her any ammunition or anything for her to stir her up or any energy, that it potentially could have gone away. She was obviously ill enough that it didn't, but I'm wondering if that in milder cases, they're hoping that they want your attention. And like children,
Yeah.
they'll take any kind of attention, good or bad, as long as there's some attention. So again, no expert, but maybe perhaps if it's at the beginning, perhaps rather than immediately engaging, perhaps see if it'll die down on its own may not be a bad way. But unfortunately, I think that all around it's a shitty situation. There's just no question about it.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And I think specifically the sort of not engaging element's really powerful
100%.
because like you say, probably your natural instinct is to somewhat sort of engage and sort of find sense. But like you say that in a lot of these cases, there is no sense. No, thank you so much for sharing your story and, being open to, share all parts of the story and also offer advice. We feel really lucky that we've had a doctor on as well. So offering that sort of understanding and experience is really great. So thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. And we really wish you all the best. And we're so sorry that this also happened to you because it must have been really difficult, but really pleased that you've come out the other side and that things have quietened down.
My pleasure. And it's nice that you guys are having this open dialogue because, as you said, there's a lot of people that are, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are managing similar type situations, and it's good to have,
Mm.
know that you're not alone and that perhaps somebody will say something that might help you through yours. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And hopefully we won't talk again.
We appreciate you.
That's a good one. Thank you so much.
We
Thank you.
appreciate
Take
you.
care. Thanks.
Thank you. His perspective on it at the end was really amazing. Like we were saying at the beginning, like it's difficult to actually feel a sense of empathy towards someone that's putting you in difficult positions. And the fact that he kind of walks away from that and it's like, it was weird. Obviously, it's super unprofessional. Like she could have kind of really ruined things in his workplace.
But also maybe that's where the key is for this story. Yeah. Having, him being a man, like you're saying, it's, really great to have that perspective. But I think the key really of this story was equally the fact that he was a doctor and had such a wonderful background in understanding mental health conditions, which also would have probably really helped him figure out how best to deal with the situation and all of that sort of stuff. So I think that it's kind of a two-parter. Yeah. I also think the fact that it's really interesting that he said in the first encounter that she was so normal, as he put it, and there was no,
But I do think that's the interesting thing actually about mental health and people that struggle in mental health is that they can live very normal lives, but it's actually, as soon as you become emotional about a certain topic, that's when certain sides come out, and that's when you start kind of making wrong decisions for yourself and people around you. But I do feel like that's also maybe why it's difficult to kind of get people the care that they need, because a lot of people, especially people that are like schizophrenic and all of these things, they need to almost, and like narcissism, and I saw the thing, it's like, how do so many people fall in love with narcissists? It's because they're so good at playing that game. You can't be a narcissist if you're not good at getting victims.
That's
and how do you get victims?
Yeah.
Like, you have to be nice, you have to be sweet, you have to be all of these things. So, but for me, what really stood out, what was kind of the most uncomfortable thing for me was the fact that she went into his practice dressed up, wearing wigs and stuff. Like, that's like a next level.
But it shows that she also, weirdness. Despite the fact that there was this split from reality, there must have been an understanding of somewhat of a reality for her to acknowledge the fact that this behavior wasn't wanted. And so therefore she had to go into the practice, dressed up to be able to engage with his staff. It's really a frightening.
And just also the fact that she brought her children into it, like that for me is just next level. That's where I almost just don't have sympathy, because it's like, it's actually like almost child abuse. Not that they almost know it, but actually it's so deeply wrong. It's
definitely troubling.
That you're using your kids as bait. And if you're doing that in a practice, in a controlled environment where it's supposed to be very professional, then what are you kind of doing behind closed doors? And that kind of, I posed myself that question when he said that. I was kind of like, oh, if she's doing that in a practice in front of people, then what is she doing
behind closed doors? Interesting episode. Lots of themes, stalking obviously at the center, but ending really talking about mental health, because that's really underpinned the conversation. So thank you so much for being with us, and we really appreciate you listening to this episode, and we hope to see you next week.